Welcome to Techlandia, a podcast about and for the technology industry, a place to learn, connect, and engage with leaders and thinkers involved in the technology industry. You can check us out at techoregon.org,
Good morning
Apple,
and
Spotify, or
welcome
wherever you
to our
listen.
latest edition
Thank you
of
for
the
listening
Techlandia
and
podcast
enjoy the
series.
show.
My name is Skip Newberry, President and CEO of TAO, and we're excited to have with us John Stephens and also Hank Hathaway from Convergence here. We're pleased to have you on.
Thanks for having us, Skip. It's our pleasure.
So I thought we could start by hearing a little bit about the company. I was wondering if you could take a minute to describe a little bit about your footprint here in Oregon, and share a little bit about the types of service offering that you all provide, and we can set some background for our listeners here.
You want to go ahead, Hank?
Yeah, sure. So Convergence Networks has been, in the Portland area for a number of years, well over a decade, and recently, in the last couple of years, they were purchased by a group out of the Northeast that has combined four separate MSPs across the top of North America, with headquarters still, being in Portland, but it has expanded our geographical reach into the Northwest. We've added a Seattle organization that is now part of Northwest or Convergence Networks as well. So I have been in the area for a long time, and will continue to expand to service the Portland market as well as the Oregon, Washington market as on top of that.
Excellent. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about your customers. What kinds of companies do you all work with, and if you could describe a little bit of background there, I think that would be helpful for our listeners to have.
Yeah, sure. So our ideal customer profile would be in somewhere in the range of 25 employees to 250 employees across any number of IT services needs, as well as cloud services, cybersecurity needs, as John will attest to as well. But we're not limited to those numbers. It's just kind of where our sweet spot is from a coverage standpoint. But ultimately, it's to provide outsourced IT and to make sure their cybersecurity profile is up to date with the latest and effective tools to protect our business. We operate in various verticals, but our key verticals are legal, manufacturing, finance, healthcare, et cetera. That's kind of where we operate, and we're efficient and very good at. But we can certainly handle any number of financial services or business services companies that are out there in a local area.
That's great. That's great. And John, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, so you're the cybersecurity lead, and I was wondering if you could share a little bit about sort of what you're seeing in the market right now in terms of both your client base and more generally, like what's keeping people up at night right now.
Well, keeping people up at night. I think you don't have to look very far at all. Every day there's a new news story that comes out about ransomware or data breach or both, in some cases. And so I think one of the big things that keep people up at night, besides just that general anxiety about cybersecurity, is that they don't know what to do. It seems like when you've got big players like Change Healthcare, or just this past weekend, the city of Cleveland got hit with ransomware. Going back a few years, we talk about things like the pipeline that got hit and everything. And so I think for a lot of SMBs, they just have this general anxiety because it's like, well, if the big guys are getting hit, what can I possibly do? And so I think there's a lot of worry out there. And what makes it even worse is I think a lot of them don't know what to do or how to get started.
That's a great point, and I think too, it can kind of seem overwhelming for a lot of companies. it almost seems like you have got kind of an overwhelming sense of just dread. When's it going to happen to me? It's not if, it's when. And yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was going to say exactly. It's not when it's not if, it's when. And I would argue that you talk to any SMB out there, and if they haven't been impacted by some type of cyber incident, they probably have peers who have. It has become so prevalent. And in fact, ultimately, we're in the space, as Hank was talking about. If you kind of do the math, we're in the SMB space. And, throughout Convergence history, we have been occupying that space because, that's where we think most of the underrepresentation for internal IT is. You've got small, medium-sized businesses that need IT services that are comparable to an enterprise level, but they can't afford that. And so throughout its history, Convergence has really tried to play in that space, and that was true when it was more managed services back in the early 2000s, as well as now when it's more cybersecurity focused. But ultimately, yeah, it's not if, it's when. And importantly, when it happens, what are you going to do, and are you going to survive?
Right. And I think companies can often, get excited about the latest, greatest technology, software solution, hardware that they're going to implement in their organization and what it's going to do for them. But of course, with the proliferation of technology comes the increased risk of cybersecurity attacks and exposure. And so it makes a lot of sense what you just described with over the evolution of the company. You've gradually kind of doubled down in the cybersecurity space, learning a lot about what the needs are of companies as they're looking to implement different IT projects. It's almost like a yin and yang phenomenon. As one expands, so too does the other. And I'm wondering if you could maybe walk us through, like, for a typical, smaller, medium-sized business, what are some of the steps that you kind of walk them through as you're starting to kind of coach them on here are the things to start thinking about as you start to develop a strategy that can prevent some of these cybersecurity attacks from happening?
Sure. And well, so, there's a lot of cybersecurity best practices and frameworks out there, but they all boil down to the same thing. You have to evaluate yourself. You have to understand the risk, and you have to understand your technology. And then you can put a plan in place and implement it. And so, some of the low-hanging fruit that we frequently run into is organizations that don't have MFA, multi-factor authentication, enabled for everything. But particularly for any kind of remote access. So, there's those things that seem to be common. It's becoming less so that organizations at the SMB level don't have MFA, but there's still a lot of them out there. And something like that is so foundational, so basic. I mean, but at the same time, ultimately, the Change Healthcare breach came down to a lack of MFA on a remotely accessible system. So it's these fundamentals. Other things are like, are you training your staff? Do they know how to recognize a phish? Do they know how to recognize a smish or a vish, where folks are trying to manipulate them to gain access to the organization? Other things like, hey, have you done a check to see how your external attack surface looks to an attacker? Can you ensure that you don't have stuff that's online that doesn't need to be and that is configured in an insecure fashion? And of course, as always, backups. What are you doing? Because if it is, in fact, when, not if, well, then you have to make sure that you're doing all the protection, but you also have a plan to recover and be a resilient organization. So it's a plethora of different things, but it really comes down to incorporating security into the business throughout, whether it be information security, physical security. It's really important that people change their thinking to incorporate it into, basically the risk equation. Everything you do in business, there's risk involved. Well, you also now have to consider that cybersecurity risk.
That's great. You made a really I think important point too about an organization is really only as secure as its weakest link. In other words, whether that's a supplier
Hmm.
that they work with, or whether it's someone on the front lines in terms of an employee or even an independent contractor. What are some of the things that companies should be thinking about in kind of both of those cases? I mean, is it how do you avoid looking at everything and everyone, or do you have to?
Well, I think you ultimately have to look at everything and everyone in as much as that's possible. But it's a journey, not a destination. When you start implementing security, you want to look for the biggest risk items. For example, when I started my IT career, it was very common for organizations to have remote access enabled through terminal services or Citrix. There was no such thing as MFA, and so it was something that it was very open to attack. Well, now what we've decided is, hey, we have to screen those remote access interfaces from the internet. Uh, Ultimately, I think it's just a matter of making sure that you're looking at it, you're evaluating the risks. Let's start from the outside in, make sure that we don't have any. Well, let's face it, it's like if you're driving into an unknown part of town and maybe it's a little rundown, do you leave your car windows open and your doors unlocked? So it's kind of the same thing. It's a escalating series of implementing security across multiple layers. So you might start by making sure that you don't have remote access enabled. You might start with ensuring that MFA is enabled, but then you start to refine that as you get more involved. And frankly, the other part of it is, besides the cybersecurity aspect, I don't know that there's a business here in the US anymore that is not subject to some kind of compliance requirement, whether they know it or not. It's something like 47 or 48 states and territories throughout the US have their own version of privacy rules and laws. And so, it's ultimately you want to get to the point where it is looking at everything and everyone, but you got to kind of ease into it, and you want to implement your security in ways that gets you the most bang for your buck. And that way you can move forward and not get breached in the meantime while you work on some of the harder stuff.
Really great points. I mean, making sure you're compliant, making sure that you've identified what are the really valuable pieces of data that
Hmm.
must be protected at all costs, versus the stuff that maybe it's a little less important, or maybe we don't end up in jail if we get that data out on the fringes breached.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of surprising how many organizations out there don't really know or have any kind of prioritization of their data. Oftentimes in this space, you'll have somebody who says, "Oh, I'm getting backups." Well, backing up what? How long are you keeping it? Where are you keeping it? Is it offline so that if you get ransomware, they can't encrypt the backups as well? So, there's all of these things that need to go into it. And let's face it, in an SMB space, that organization is usually good at what they do. They're not going to be IT or cybersecurity professionals. And so, from my perspective, and I've been in this industry over 20 years, it's like we really need to help. You need somebody who knows what they're doing and can help you prioritize and figure out the best way to protect yourself.
And what are you seeing as it relates to people in particular, and some of the social engineering that you mentioned, phishing and smishing and a variety of other varieties or flavors out there, with the rise of AI
Mhm.
and deep fakes and some of the opportunities to really kind of fool people getting better and better in terms of quality. What are some things out there that you've seen companies try to do to kind of mitigate?
Well, so obviously there's education. Folks need to know that there are threats out there, and they need to be up to date in regard to the awareness that, hey, it's not just I might get a phishing email. They might send a text message. They might call me. They might call me and ask fairly innocuous questions because they're just trying to get my voice so that they can use some of that AI and the deep fake technology to replicate myself, so that maybe instead of sending you an email allegedly from, the CEO saying, hey, buy some gift cards, I can leave a voice message and it sounds just like him or her, right? So one of the biggest items is awareness, but then the other part is just, this is where the making sure that you have layered security. You might also hear this referred to as defense in depth, where there's just no one magic bullet solution that will fix everything. It's not a technology problem; it's a holistic business problem. You have to involve the people. You have to have technology. And unfortunately, you usually have to have processes and procedures. I mean, let's face it, how many people inherently understand that, like in accounting, you don't have AR and AP being done by the same person because it places you at risk for fraud? Well, it's kind of that same intuitiveness that you have to apply to cybersecurity, and make sure you're thinking about the full attack surface and all the different ways that you can be affected. I think for a lot of organizations, like we mentioned earlier, it can be downright overwhelming.
In terms of benchmarking a company's existing practices, is that something that you all typically find is something that is a starting point for most of your engagements?
So, from a security perspective, that is one that I would highly encourage and that our staff do seek to put our clients on in regard to cybersecurity. Several years ago, NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, came out with the cybersecurity framework. It's a data agnostic, industry agnostic framework. And so by default, when we start working with clients, we like to leverage that because, frankly, just about every best practice or security framework around is all based on the same generic principles. It's all those best practices. But this gives folks a guide against which to measure themselves, and they don't have to just take, some consultant's version of it. There's actually a standard, so that this is something that's been thought out. We're on version 2.0 as of this past year, so it's something that the framework is absolutely something that you want to implement. And then the other thing is that gives you a foundation for both security and future compliance, because like I said, if everyone's subject to some kind of compliance requirement, whether they know it or not, it's a lot easier to comply with that and to make sure that you're treating data accordingly if you've got a foundation already in place.
Makes a lot of sense. And shifting gears a little bit here, I'm wondering, in terms of the various IT projects that you're seeing in terms of demand out there from some of your clients, and maybe this is more of a question for Hank, but what are some of the trends that you're seeing right now in terms of what companies are looking to adopt? Like, what's their core focus right now when it comes to IT?
So the interesting thing, and I will let John jump in here as well, but the interesting thing from my perspective, from a sales perspective per se, or a new client perspective, is vulnerability management, right? Incident response, and do they have a business continuity plan? Do they have this disaster recovery plan? Do they have 24/7 monitoring? MDR. Is there patch management or their asset management in the right position? And the answer is mostly no. So from a project standpoint, a security project standpoint, it's pretty vital as we move forward. As John was mentioning, the threats are evolving, with AI, with automation, and it's just going to increase. And if we think back 5 years ago, even to now, it's actually unbelievable, the explosive growth that we're seeing in the cyber security risk arena, right? So, email security, all of these things are leading to various projects within within the IT world, especially the cybersecurity world. But John, go ahead and talk about maybe directly a few of the projects that we're seeing that might be common.
Sure. So, and I mentioned it before, you want to make sure you have MFA, and MFA has become far more prevalent in today's environment among the SMB space. But frankly, there's still organizations that don't have MFA enabled for remote access. And so we do a lot of projects like that. We do a lot of projects where folks are migrating their data, whether it be their file server data from back in the day to SharePoint, or they're migrating an on-prem app to the cloud. But a lot of it is making sure that the data is migrated to whatever the platform is, but then also making sure it's done securely. One of the trends that I saw several years ago, or we saw, I wasn't the only one. A lot of folks just automatically assumed that if you were moving your email to the cloud, it was going to be more secure. But that's essentially like saying, okay, I'm used to living on an island where I don't have to lock my doors and windows and there's never anybody going to mess with me, to now I've moved to the middle of the big city. There's, hundreds of thousands of people, and I'm still not locking my doors and windows, So people would move to the cloud and they wouldn't take advantage of the additional security. Other things that we see, like Hank mentioned, moving my email to a more secure platform. Again, the implementing business intelligence into organizations in terms of making sure that as they're trying to utilize the new tools, whether it be, Microsoft Copilot or ChatGPT, making sure that, they're doing it and are aware of the risks involved and that they're doing it in a secure fashion. There's just so many, and especially for us, because we support so many verticals, it's like, the notion of a typical project or a typical thing. It's like, well, yes. How do I describe it? Yeah, all of that and then some usually.
Right, right. And I think, one of the points that you both made about, kind of the ongoing nature of cybersecurity. It's not just something that you can, spend some time, a couple weeks, maybe a month. Okay, we've got our stuff in order. Let's just forget it and leave it. It's a consistent, ongoing discipline. And I'm wondering, in terms of the information sharing side of things, because we talked a little bit about some of the different strategies and tools that folks can implement and processes. How do you recommend they stay up on some of the latest threats and attacks that are out there, so that they're not reading about it in the paper the next day or online and they're like, oh, little too late? How do they get ahead of some of this?
Well, and I don't want it to be the be all end all answer to everything, but it's become a point that I think it is virtually impossible for a small business or even larger businesses to stay informed unless they have somebody dedicated to doing it. For example, in large enterprise, there might be a threat hunting or threat intelligence team. Well, in the SMB space, obviously, you don't have the budget for that, but maybe you can partner with an organization that does. For example, Convergence, we partner with a variety of different vendors out there in the security space. And generally speaking, every morning, we're coming in and reviewing the threat intel, seeing what the latest attacks are, seeing what CISA has issued warnings about, et cetera. And so, to kind of come back to the simple answer, somebody's got to be in charge of it and they have to know what they're doing. And so whether that be in an organization that has somebody they can hire, or oftentimes for the SMB, it's you want to partner with an organization that can bring those capabilities to the forefront, and legitimately so. It's easy to watch a webinar last night and then come in and say, hey, I learned about this and now I'm an expert. Well, no, not really. You're just starting to get exposed to it. You need somebody who can actually separate the signal from the noise and tell you what's relevant to your organization.
That's great. So as we near the end of our time, I wanted to take a moment and see if there's any sort of words of wisdom or parting thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience.
I would think that ultimately there's two things. One, make sure you're doing security, and oftentimes that's outside of the technical capability or the knowledge of the business people. So they need to talk to somebody who can verify that. So it's both do security and then trust and verify to make sure that your security is effective. It's still one of those situations where it's easy to make mistakes in the cloud, especially if you're using a variety of cloud vendors. And so what's important is, one, make sure you do it right to begin with, but two, check and continually and constantly check to ensure that the security that you think you implemented is actually effective. So that's, where you start talking about things like making sure you're doing vulnerability scanning, making sure your patching system is working, maybe doing a pen test. All of these things, ultimately what it's about is trying to verify that you are secure. And if you don't do it before the attackers do, well, it's too late, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and I would add, to John's point, it's very difficult for the SMB space to be good at both, right? To be good at the IT and the cybersecurity, as well as focus on their core business. So partner with somebody that that can provide that 24/7 support, IT support, or remote help desk support, or after hours emergency services, whatever. And then also with an organization and that can provide that IT strategy or that road mapping or that business review, right? Somebody that's got their own knock or their SOC, they've got MDR in place, and endpoint security is top of mind, and they're monitoring that for these organizations, right? Compliance is a big issue that we haven't really talked about here, but in some cases it's very relevant for some of the businesses that we work with, and so we can go down the list, from backup to disaster recovery to business continuity to email security, as we've spoken about, but ultimately, what we find is that the majority of the businesses out there are very reactive when they get hit. And I think there's a little bit of a misnomer that it's an easy resolution, right? We're seeing businesses that have been in business for 5, 10, 15 years at risk of closing their doors, right? And we numerous times, numerous examples of owners saying, asking us at, a week into this attack, saying, am I going to lose my business? And it's very impactful when they realize that. So we need to be proactive. You need to be proactive with your organization, protecting your organization, and making sure that you have a plan. And the majority of the companies in that small to mid-sized space don't necessarily have that plan, right? And it is ever changing. The threat is ever changing. So make sure you're aligning with people within your organization or outside of your organization that can help you through that process. As John mentioned earlier, it's not if, it's when.
Well said. I think a lot of folks will often look at cybersecurity as, well, it's going to take some time, or it's going to be expensive. But then you have to think about, well, how expensive is it when you're not in compliance, you've been hacked, and to your point, you're at risk of losing your entire business. So
yes.
I think those are thoughts that people need to keep front and center. And what's great is we have folks like Convergence Networks here as a resource for a lot of the SMBs in the region. So Hank and John, thank you again for taking some time out of your busy schedules to join us and share some of that knowledge and thought leadership with our audience. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure
It's been
to
a
be
pleasure.
here with
Thank
you.
you.